Okay. All right. We're recording. Okay. Welcome back to Top of the Pile. My guest today is Brian Lawler, a senior sales leader at Amazon. Brian has a very impressive career in the advertising industry, holding senior roles at blue chip companies, including DoubleClick, News Corp, AOL, LinkedIn, and for the past 7+ years at Amazon. Brian is an incredibly talented salesperson and sales leader and is so well respected by his clients and his colleagues. On a personal note, I was very fortunate to have the chance to work with Brian as a candidate during my days as an executive recruiter. And I feel so fortunate to have stayed in touch with Brian. He is a proud alum of Providence College, where he graduated with a marketing degree. Go Friars. One of Brian's strengths and passions is his ability to develop and mentor up and coming talent. So I think that's why he is a perfect guest for Top of the Pile. I've learned so much from Brian over the years, and I know anyone listening to this episode will learn so much as well. So welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Karen. Really excited to be on the podcast today.
Awesome. Awesome. So, in our agenda today, we're going to hear about Brian's background and his experiences. And, there is something called the Amazon core principles. And I think hearing how Brian has been able to apply those in his experience in his career. Um, and, there's also something called the magic loop, which maybe Brian will enlighten us on what that is. So just to keep everybody on the edge of their seat. So let's get started. So Brian, you were a marketing major undergrad and you started your sales career in direct marketing. What in general made you interested in a sales career?
It's a great question. So, graduating Providence, I was fortunate enough to really focus on my career early. My goal was to come out of Providence with an offer in hand, and I was able to achieve that. So, a lot of times when I'm talking to a lot of current students, I talk about the ROI, and that ROI is shown in how are you going to set yourself up for your career. So for me, what at that time when I was coming out, it was all around like the typical banking, insurance, and I knew for me that I was more of media and sales. And the reason I wanted to get into sales was I want to be as close to the customer as possible. And it's interesting how I can look back now years later and I work for the most customer obsessed company, and that is our mantra. But I knew early on that, and I always called it the moment of truth. The moment of truth is when a customer says yes. And I knew that being in a frontline sales slash marketing role early in my career was going to allow me to achieve that.
Okay, that's great. And I think that is something that, even if someone doesn't want to be a frontline seller, I think you can still be very customer focused and supporting that cause. And I think that's good for young people to always think about the what is the main goal of the company you're working for, the company you want to work for, and what are they trying to achieve at the end of the day? What are they selling or bringing to the market? And I think a lot of people don't, young people in particular, don't always think about that bigger picture of what a company is trying to achieve. They look at that small, like what their job will be, and not thinking about it in the whole landscape of what a company is trying to achieve. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you could have said it better, Karen. Um, Companies have missions, they have values, and they're published. And what I tell a lot of people is you have to identify with that company and their mission and their values. A lot of times, what people will be enamored by is their logo, but beneath that logo is a leadership team that is moving forward with a very clear direction, and that's established at that C suite. And yes, people can come into companies and want to be change agents, but inherently, those companies are driven by a mantra. Here at Amazon, we call them leadership principles. But what I've always found, my career is if you are able in that interview process to buy into what that mission is, it's going to help you accept your role and thrive in that role. Going back to your point is there has to be a deeper and higher purpose to your role than just executing the role.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it'll make it more enjoyable in general, just a day to day, to know that I'm working towards something too, even though my job may seem so minor. Um, I think that's great. And I think you're right. That's why in the process, I always say you have to go do more quality versus quantities. People are trying to like, how many job applications can I get out there as opposed to let me do less and go deep on really understanding because you're just going to show up in such a better place in the interview process. But um, so in your career, I think what I understand from your background is that when you were selling at say AOL and LinkedIn, you were in a technology consumer electronics category focused role. And I think what's good for people to understand, especially in advertising sales, will typically end up focusing on a category or an industry. And so that's what your relationships will be based in that area, but you can also shift. So it looks like when you went to Amazon, you shifted to more of a home category, correct? So, or maybe you started in consumer electronics, and I think that's something for people to understand. So you can shift, but maybe you use the bridge of consumer electronics to go from one company to the next. I don't know if I'm asking that question correctly, but
You are, and that's exactly right. So, coming into AOL, I did not have deep consumer electronics experience working with the Samsungs, the LGs, the Comcast, the Microsofts of the world. But I was given an opportunity to learn that category. And then throughout my time there, and we're going to talk about this later with the magic loop, it's what can I do more than what my current role is? How can I ask my manager to take on more, expand my skill set? Um, and what I was able to do is while at AOL, I then transitioned out and I went over to LinkedIn because I had a definitive expertise in that category in consumer electronics, which was great. And I was able to actually work with the Microsoft account, which was their largest global customer. And about 7 months into my tenure there, Microsoft acquired LinkedIn. So that was a super, super interesting time. But the point being here is then when I went over to Amazon, I had relevant consumer electronics experience. But if you look at my LinkedIn profile right now, you're going to see about 5 or 6 different roles that started with consumer electronics and now have me moved into multiple categories beyond consumer electronics. So I always talk about the underpinnings of how you go to market, how you either lead customers or lead a sales team, and those are transferable. The expertise you're going to get, the expertise you can get by being smart and listening to podcasts, right, and daily emails and different industry trades and pubs. But for me, it's always been about that idea of how can I get better, how can I do more, and that opened up doors well beyond the current role that I'm in today and some of the roles I had before.
yeah, it's like you need to be a utility player, someone
Yeah,
who has all those core skills. And for the baseball reference, I guess,
yeah,
is be able to, what you need me to work on consumer electronics? Great. You need me to move over to telco or whatever, or CPG, whatever it might be. You know how to open doors and create relationships, which is obviously the
absolutely.
number one thing. Um, okay, so Amazon, if I have this number right, has about 1.5 million employees. Is that correct?
It's a lot. I don't know the
It's
exact number, but yes, it is
okay.
well in excess of 1 million globally, I'm assuming.
Okay. That's something I must have Googled, but um what I understand is Amazon has something called the Amazon 14 core principles, and those are something that I guess all employees are invited to use as a guide in the way they perform their job, and maybe it's something for their life in general. But um, maybe I can list them out, or you can list them out, and we can talk about a few of your favorites. But I, having read through these, I think, and never worked at Amazon, I feel like these are just really backbone type core principles that any employee in any really industry or field can apply to their daily life.
Yeah, the leadership principles were founded by Jeff Bezos. When he started the company, it was back in 1993. And these are the defining ways that we go to market, whether we're discussing a new project or deciding how to solve a problem. It's something that Amazon relies on in every single meeting, every single document, every single presentation. every single year-end review of your performance. And then we also measure ourselves against these leadership principles really with our customers, and that's where it really comes down to. We do have a thing, here also called raising the bar, which is a separate thing in the hiring process I can go into later. But the leadership principles drive the direction of the company and all of the decisions that are made, whether it's from our CEO all the way down to that customer receiving their package on their doorstep. Those leadership principles are followed throughout the entire company. It's not just relegated to one division or a certain level of the company. The leadership principles, no matter where you are in the organization, you understand that that's what we're striving for, and everybody has to, believe and follow and adhere to those leadership principles, because that's really what makes Amazon unique. And we like to say the word peculiar, in our own unique way.
Okay, so maybe I'll read them through. Does that make sense for me to read them through?
Sure. I mean, it's quite a bit, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's actually 16 of them, and we added two
Oh,
more. Um,
okay, so maybe I won't read them through. Maybe we'll just, so let's focus on a couple of them. I know you have a couple that maybe are your favorites, or two that a couple that you think might be really critical for young people as they're entering their
yeah.
career. I'll leave a link in the show notes to what the 14 or 16 full principles are, but maybe do you want to hone in on a couple of them and speak to a few of them?
Yeah. What I can do is, if this is really more towards the career oriented, the ones such as, earns trust and learn and be curious, hire and develop the best, and bias for action, those would be the ones that I think I can definitely go deeper on. But why don't we start from the top, and then I'll cascade it from down there, Karen. Does that work?
Sure. Perfect.
Yeah. So in talking about our leadership principles, the one that we're most known for is customer obsession. And customer obsession really allows us to focus on that customer and do something that we call work backwards. And by working backwards from the customer all the way back to the idea of wherever that concept came from, what we're trying to do as leaders here is to pay attention to what the customers desire. And we actually use the word obsess over customers. And that's really the essence of how the company's operated and run. What I also want to call out here is, this is my personal reflection and opinion on the leadership principles, how I apply them. But generally, Amazon has their 16 leadership principles. But what I really want to talk about today is my personal experience with these leadership principles and how I've applied them in my career.
Great. Great. So do you want to, how should we do this next then? Do you want to just pick out a couple of them and speak to them, or how is it best for you to break it down?
Yeah, I think if this is more towards getting to the top of the pile, I think the ones that you and I could talk about is a bias for action. I would say is one,
Yeah.
which is speed, right? You got to be in early and fast. I would say learn and be curious is something that early on in people's career we want to make sure people are looking for that. So we can do that one second. Um, Let me
Let's start
just
with those two.
yeah,
I think those two are good. I mean, so if we start with bias for action, which I have as number 9 on my list, I don't know if they're in
yeah.
any specific order, but um, talk about what that means for you, a bias for action, and how someone can hear that and try to have it be something that it's in the back of their mind in their day-to-day career.
Sure. Yeah, so bias for action really comes down to speed, but it goes beyond speed. When I think about bias for action and what our definition is of bias for action, it's that speed matters. And a lot of these decisions that we're making, they don't need to have extensive study and inspection, but they need to be done at enough of an inspection level that we feel like we can take as good a bet as possible to actually move the business forward. And you're not going to get every decision right, but complacency is really what the alternative is, and we don't want to wait. And when I talk to a lot of recruits or talent out in the marketplace, a lot of them try to be they get paralyzed with perfection.
Mhm.
And it's kind of what you were saying earlier, Karen, which is it doesn't need to be the massive, quantity of, hey, I'm going to focus my search here on all these different companies. A more bespoke but speed critical one is what I would suggest. And when I talk about speed, it's not just on hitting the apply button. It's the speed to think about what is the strategy I'm going to roll out. How quickly can I think of a strategy? How quickly can I use my network? How quickly can I rely on others? It's about this constant speed and motion because in the job search, yes, it's challenging whether you have a job and you're looking for a job or you don't have a job. This notion of speed is critical because otherwise you'll lose your momentum. And that's why it's important to make a decision or make a path forward. But don't worry about, hey, I went down the wrong path. That's totally fine. These things are reversible. We call them one-way or two-way door decisions. And a lot of what we're talking about with bias for action, especially early in your career, it's a two-way door decision. That one door is not going to open and shut and be done. We actually have an opportunity, if we use speed intelligently, to impact our career and to get that momentum going on what we would call the flywheel.
Yeah, you know what? The momentum is so critical. I think that's such a basic, obvious thing that people lose track of, that they start to go down a road and they get a little bit of a roadblock and they take this big pause, and or they just completely abandon that possible networking connection or whatever it might be. And even if you don't get you get a first round interview and maybe you don't get the second round interview, how many times I see people never follow up with that company again. And often it was just, you just lost out from some minor little difference. That other person had a little bit of an edge on you with something in their experience. And you lose it and you don't realize that they really liked you. And that door was open a crack. Keep it open a crack. That's, I think, momentum is keeping the many doors open a crack and then hopefully making that crack larger and larger. But the momentum thing is so big, and you really hit it with that. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I love the name. I've always loved the name of your podcast, Top of the Pile. But it's also be top of mind. And a
Mhm.
lot of times the decisions and the communication around hiring are fluid, right? That job could be open and then all of a sudden they're going to put a slight pause on it because of maybe a financial quarter or reporting of earnings, or maybe there's other shifts happening at that company with leadership and maybe somebody else coming into that role, but they're not going to disclose that. So there's a lot of ebb and flow. That constant being top of mind is really, really important.
Yeah, it's so important. And how many times, like maybe that candidate A that got the second round interview, when they call that person, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I already went in a different direction." And guess what? Then they're going to B, and B could be B could be B1, 2, and 3. There could be a few Bs, and you're one of them. And if you're the one that reached out to them and said, "Thank you, I'd love to be kept in mind," and then you send another note like, "I just saw this article in your company. I hope you're still keeping me in mind." They're going to, like, hands down, they're calling you before they're calling the other B candidates, because you're, like you said, you're keeping the faucet dripping. And I swear, if there's one thing anybody listens to on this podcast, that is probably the number one thing, is just to keep yourself top of mind. And it's not that hard, actually.
It's not.
Um,
It's not. But and that's why the bias for action and speed matters. I mean, a
yeah,
lot of people, they all have the best of intentions, right? They read this great article and there is the vice president of sales who's mentioned in that article. And they have this great thought, you know what? I'm going to read the article. I'm going to follow that person by the end of the week. They're going to forget. Do a Google search, go on LinkedIn, figure out how to get a hold of that person, and drop them a 4 sentence email that day. Don't wait and
yeah,
say, hey, I read this. I was really intrigued by it. I would love to have an open communication with your team on any future opportunities or HR opportunities. And maybe that person is going to read it and be intrigued and press the forward button. And now
yeah.
all of a sudden, it opens up doors. But by having that speed, it changes how quickly you can get ahead of this in the process.
Yeah, and I love that you just said, a 3 or 4 sentence note. Too often we get stuck needing to write like a college essay about ourselves. And I'm sorry to say, the person really doesn't want to read it, because what you're writing to them about is about them. It's not about you. It's about
Always.
them and what they need and complimenting them. Your story is waiting to be told.
It
It's
is.
not yet. um, okay, I love that. So, all right. And so what was the other one we were going to talk about? Was it learn and be curious or?
Learn to be curious.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay, great. I know, curious is the number one word that you probably want to relay in your interview process to show that you're willing to roll up your sleeves and you like to learn. So what does it mean to you in your experience?
Here at Amazon, and in my personal experience, learn to be curious is a critical leadership principle we look for, and it may not be the most common one. Uh, but the way that we look at curiosities around that, leaders are still never done learning. They're always seeking to improve themselves. They're curious about different projects. They're curious about learning different new skills. They're curious about learning different ways to lead their team. So for me, when I'm talking to a lot of candidates, they're not expecting the curiosity question because they think their definition of their success is all relegated to their resume, their LinkedIn profile, and all of their attainments or achievements or awards. What I really want to get to in the process, but what really makes you tick? What are you excited about? Because the skill set that we're hiring you for is very definitive. And we're going to talk about this later around the magic loop, but for that employee to excel and thrive, there has to be something more than just that role and filling that role. Because then, if there's nothing beyond that, then you're basically just a line employee doing and executing your job very well. But at a certain point, that person is going to desire more. And that's where that curiosity piece comes in. Where I like to see it happen is really around that curiosity, around skill set or critical thinking, where you can tie it to a passion. So I always tell folks on my team when we're doing our one-on-ones, I don't have a passion tree, in my office that I could just grab it off and say, here it is. You have to find your passion, your skills, and what are you excited about? And if you can combine that within the company and the organization to do a side project that has meaning, that's going to allow you to take others with you on this path and journey of curiosity. And now you build a cohort and a team. And that's where the real fun of the role happens, which is it expands beyond the day-to-day and the organizational impact you can have while being curious, while up leveling your skills, and hopefully having some fun with it.
Yeah, I love that. And listen, all companies might not have the type of environment that supports that. So I think you have to make a decision. Maybe it's something that you create or in a very small way within whatever environment you find yourself in. It could be a small boutique company, mid-size, large, but I love that idea. And do you ever, so when you ask the curious question, is it, let's say for someone who's really young, like they're just coming out of school or they're a few years into their career, um, do you also ask questions about how they explore their curiosity and passion, in work and in their private life? Like, how do you get into asking them about their curiosity outside of the office when they haven't had a lot of office experience? I'm just curious about that myself.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, when it comes to the private life, they'll offer that generally, right?
Yeah.
But I'll find a way to get that out of them. I think if it's early in the career, and specifically if it's with new entrants into the workforce, let's call them, college, coming out or graduate students, a lot of that is going to be tied to a lot of group project setting or maybe some coursework or things they did outside of their day to day, in the curriculum or worked with a professor or someone else. That shows curiosity right there, right? How are you taking your learning to a different level? And that's really what this curiosity piece is about, is how can we take your learning and skill set and grow it?
Yep.
And early in the career, it's an easy way to demonstrate that with different projects or organizations they're tied to or impact they had on a campus or in a community.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad we talked about that because I think sometimes I can get myself into the head of someone listening and having them say, well, how would I do that? And I think that's exactly right, is you do have to have, I call them mini stories, but from your experiences, you have to tell a little story about, well, in my marketing class or my marketing analytics class, I don't usually like numbers, but I found I loved
Yep.
discovering patterns and whatever it might be. So, okay, I love that learn and be curious one, and have a little grit, right? I think that's kind of the backbone behind that.
Well, that's a separate one, which is disagree, commit, and have backbone. That's one I do think a lot of the, um, the newer folks in their career are probably going to be very timid and shy.
Mhm.
But a lot of times with that, it can lead into another one, which is what we would call earned trust, which is if you have a little, if you can exhibit that backbone and do it in a respectful and meaningful way. Um, I find it to be really powerful. We could also talk about, secondly, Karen. I don't know if I think I've told you about this before, but Radical Candor, the Kim Scott book.
Oh,
It's
yes.
it's one of the best books out there, and it really talks about how somebody can, really create a culture of collaboration. And you do that by respectfully challenging. So I do think that's something we could, as part of the podcast, go down, because that's not Amazon endorsed, but Kim Scott wrote a great book and has great content where I do think it is something that it really allows people to test their backbone and do it in a respectful way.
Oh, that's great. I will definitely include a link to that book in the show notes as well. And I think you did mention that, and I'm overdue to get it myself, so I need to get it.
Yeah.
Um, okay, I love that. I mean, do you want to talk more about the book, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, so you've read the book, I take it.
I've read the book. We've done some trainings on it. There's a great YouTube, short little series on it. I mean,
Mm.
it's really a very, very strong, bite-sized, digestible type of mantra. It's not this 400-page book that people have to slog through and are writing notes. A lot of it is very logical,
Hmm.
but what it does challenge those reading it is to stand up for something that you actually see and believe in. And many times in a corporate culture, many times people are going to say, you know what, that's not on my remit, I'm going to let that go, and then those defects could continue further down the line. With something like Radical Candor, it really allows you to have that feedback loop in a respectful manner, and it's okay to be challenged. I'm challenged all the time, but you have to be professional in that challenge of others, so that you could achieve greater results.
Yeah, and I think that's a great thing for young people or anyone in any point of their career, but it's probably something that gets harder to start later in your career if you haven't done it. I think it's got to be practiced, but the professionalism is the key. And it's okay because people are going to say, you're being thoughtful. You're actually, you care. That's what you're
Exactly.
saying. You're saying, I care about how our company succeeds, if and how, or how our team succeeds, our group, our little project, whatever we're working on. I care about it. And I was thinking, you know what, maybe if we did it this way, it might work better. And then, you know what, people could say, that's fabulous. Why have we never thought of that? Or, you know what, we've thought of that before. It hasn't worked, blah, 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 whatever it might be. But it says you care. Yeah.
So Karen, I know that you said it the best way possible, which is about caring. So Radical Candor is about caring personally,
Hmm.
and it's also challenging directly. And those two can coexist. They're not mutually exclusive. You can care and challenge. And that to me is the essence of why Kim Scott has done such a great job with her book and her whole mantra around radical candor, because that feedback is absolutely critical to improve the leadership or the guidance or that mission of that company or team or project.
Yeah. And I think it's got to be the kind of thing, it's a very different thing than complaining, you know,
Correct.
not to be confused with complaining, because if there's a process that's not working and you really don't like the process of whatever it is going on, and you just come to complain, well, that's complaining. But if you come and say, you know what, I know we do it this, and this way, and this is the higher, whatever it is. But I wonder if we did it like this, it might be more efficient, or it might cause a more productive result, whatever it is. That's coming to the table with radical candor, right? Correct?
It is. It is. And a lot of times when somebody comes and we discuss it, my feedback to them is, well, show me what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And now all of a sudden they have an ownership piece in this. If this is something you care about and you truly believe, write it out,
Yep.
build it out for me, and let's work on it. And then when we can get it to a good enough point, how can I then take this and champion this and bring others in and radically, challenge them and have candor and say, hey, someone on my team has brought this. I believe in this myself. I care about this. I wasn't aware of this. And now all of a sudden you're getting that momentum, like we spoke about earlier, that speed. And all of a sudden you get people to care more.
Totally. I really love that. I'm excited to read that book and I hope everybody checks it out. And I feel like on that note, what you're saying is making me think of this magic loop. So let's talk about the magic loop for a second, which is something that Brian brought to my attention. And it's a recipe for success, if you will. And so do you want to explain it? Do you want to talk about kind of what it is in general? I have sort of the notes on how to explain it, but you tell me if you want to explain it.
Sure. So being an Amazonian, I heard about the magic loop, but I didn't hear about it within the four walls of Amazon. I actually heard about it through other industry publications. There was a gentleman by the name of Ethan Evans who worked at Amazon for many years. And he employed his own process by which he wanted to improve his team. So what is the magic loop? It's a process through which any employee can systematically grow at a company. And what's great about it is if these five basic steps are followed, it creates this loop in a very straightforward model that can allow employees to optimize their performance. It allows them to explore different opportunities. And really, what it allows them to do is to have more control with their manager. And one of the key things within the magic loop in the five steps is that feedback loop with a manager. So I can go into those five steps and what it is. But what I would encourage everybody, take a look at Ethan Evans, Google him. He's a very, very impressive speaker and author, and had a great successful track record and is now on his own. So I can walk everyone through what those five steps are.
That would be great. I think that would be awesome. And also, I will include in the show notes some links on the loop. And I even found some YouTube videos on Ethan Evans speaking directly about the magic loop. And on one of them, I'll try to refind, was almost like a call in. People were sending in questions about it during this live chat that he was having. And they were asking specific questions about applying it in their day-to-day job. And it was really interesting to see how people were asking these questions. So, okay, so started us off. I know the first one is do your main job well, correct? Or something along those lines.
Correct. Yes. The first step in the magic loop is do your current job well.
And that's pretty, I guess it can be obvious, but what I understand is that, it starts off with the feedback that you're working to always improve. You're asking for feedback to make sure that you don't just think you're doing your job well, but you actually are doing your job well. So I imagine that first step requires feedback. But first of all, let's go back for a minute. Doing your job well, and we spoke about this earlier, it's important that you know what your company's mission is, goals are, what they're trying to achieve, and essentially like what they're paying you to do, correct?
Correct. Uh, Everyone has a job requisition. They know exactly what the guardrails are, what their performance is going to be. And that's very clear. And that's what you're measured on, whether it's here or most companies, right? It's how did you do? How did you execute? Those leadership principles that I spoke about earlier really come into play because it gives you a foundation to actually show up at that year, the end review, and think about how did my performance in my job that I'm trying to do as well as I can, map back to those principles. It's not just, hey, did I achieve my sales quota? Well, then I would map that back. Did I deliver results? And then
Mhm.
I look at the definition of what that is. And then I embrace that. So when I'm having my review, I can go super deep on how I delivered those results. What did I do to overcome challenges? What did I do to go above and beyond? So having the consistency of what your job is, but laddering it back is going to put you in a different position because they're going to say, wow, this person believes, embraces, and lives these leadership principles. They are perceived as doing their job better than most versus just doing the job.
Correct. Okay, that's great. And this can be done anywhere. Like, I don't want people to think you have to be working at Amazon. These are
Correct.
such basic, in some ways obvious, but it's such, earning trust. I mean, these are things that need to be done in life in general to get respect and to be heard. You need to earn trust. And that's what you do as a salesperson, right? You're earning the trust of the customer to trust that you're going to recommend the best um, the products for them. Okay, so you're doing your job well. You know what you're doing. What is number two?
Uh, Before we actually move on to number two, I
Okay.
want to just be clear on number one. Um, there is a hierarchy in any company in terms of management and employees. Doing your job well means doing the job that you're like that we just discussed, but it's helping your manager do their job. So I talk about it in what I would call lead and feed the boss, right? Doing your job well is how am I making my manager, you know, better at their job or they constantly need help. So what I always talk to, employees about this, it's you're doing your job well, but you're doing it in a way by which your manager is appreciative of you going beyond that.
Yeah. And I think I hate to say this for people who are listening who are just starting their careers, but you are an early career professional, or you are an entry level professional for more than 1 year. You are an entry level professional for a number of years, and it can vary by role, by department, by industry. But I think it's always normal that everybody says, I just graduated with this fabulous degree. I'm very smart. I'm capable. I'm doing all these things. Why am I not getting promoted yet? But you've got to remember those first number of years are all about serving and, making sure your manager is achieving all of their goals. You have goals, but they're all rolled up under your manager goals. Is that accurate
That's
to say, I guess?
It is accurate. And, Karen, step two is ask your manager how you can help. So
Mm-hmm.
you're exactly right. Managers always need help. They're always looking for other ways to grow the company, push boundaries. And, if you're in that meeting and the manager is ideating coming up, don't be the person staring at your laptop or at your phone with your head down. Be the person with your hand held in the air and saying, I'll take that. I
Yeah.
would love to, help out. That initiative is really what's going to make you stand out. So, step two is really about asking your manager how you can help.
Yeah. And I think this is where a lot of times this is a big time management thing too. As you're working anywhere, you need to be organized and do the speed piece and be efficient and not overdo things so they're perfect. Be open to making a mistake now and again, but do your job well, obviously. But I think people get stuck at this stage and just get on that, as we talked about, the hamster wheel, and they don't take, and maybe it's actually scheduling time in your day and your week. Maybe over the weekend there's a half an hour that you reflect on the week, and you always have a sense of, where have I been, where am I now, where am I going, what are my career goals for the next few months, the next year? Like, where am I going in my next big annual review? What am I hoping to achieve, and have that conversation? Like, so, it's about you, but right now it's focused on that. Those core principles are, I guess, or goals are really about how are you helping your boss? So I hope that's not confusing, but I think people do get stuck on just doing the task, doing the task, doing the task, which they think is helping their boss, but they're not thinking outside, taking a few minutes outside of that to say, okay, what could I do better? And what else does my manager need? And how could I do a little bit more for that manager? So that's just one piece I wanted to add in.
Great. I agree. And here's the last thing I want to talk about. Step number two is managers notice who steps up. We notice it. And that's a critical tiebreaker when evaluation of talent comes down.
Mm-hmm.
There we have so many metrics, so many KPIs that employees could be measured on, but those that are noticed for going outside and going above and beyond, that has a critical um, piece in terms of their overall perception within the organization.
Yeah. And it shows eagerness. It's back to that curiosity. It's all tied
Sure.
to the curiosity because it says, I want to do more because I want to learn more and I want to grow my career. I want to help you. And behind that is I'm helping myself, I guess. But yeah, whatever is asked. And I don't know if this is part of the next one, but I had in my notes that, and I think it's such an important piece, is that feedback is a gift. And that if you keep asking your boss, how can I make your job and success better? How can I help you and those above you? How can I help them better? And if there's feedback that's critical on what you're doing already, then realize that that is a gift for you. That is feedback is a gift because you may not agree with it. And if you don't, say, help me understand more or, ask for additional, but not in the complaining filter, in a way that you're trying to be productive. Um, okay, I think that's two. And then that kind of leads us into three, correct?
Correct. Yep. And step three is do what you're asked. And
Okay.
really, what that comes down to is when a manager makes that request, it may not be exactly what you're hoping for, but try to make an honest attempt to help and see that through, because that's where you're going to earn that trust. And maybe perhaps along the way, it's not the idyllic situation you thought it was, or maybe the skill set required is beyond your skill set. Well, that's where you need to, from a feedback loop, go to others and seek their feedback. Hey, I need some advice, or hey, I need some help. But this constant loop, right? The magic loop is around feedback.
Mm-hmm.
But it does boil down to what is the request by which your manager asks and how can you achieve it? And if you can't achieve it solely on your own, get feedback from others and maybe bring them into the process.
Right. Okay. So that's the real magic then comes in. So you're doing your job well. You're asking your boss, how can I help to make things better? How can I help you, my boss? The third step is do whatever is asked.
Correct.
Once you've asked the boss and they tell you what you can do extra or whatever it might be, do that. And then the next step is, I think, where that magic piece comes in of the feedback is you've done all of that. Then you maybe have a position where you can say, is there a way that I can help you, as I've asked, but also help me learn a new skill, grow my career, whatever you may have to be kind of clear on that. That's sort of that real magic piece that comes in. Is that right?
Yeah. Where the magic comes in is if you can execute on steps one, two, and three, step four is about asking your manager how you can help in line with one of your career goals, right? So it's now that, hey, I've done all of this, I'm putting a lot of equity and effort in. Now I need your help from the manager. And that's where this feedback and interest can happen at the management level to help that employee really start to think about the career goal and how that manager can help support them.
Yeah. And managers do have a responsibility to develop their talent. They do. I think what gets argued about sometimes is what the timeline on certain promotions and money increases and things like that might be. I think it's more important to worry about, am I growing my skills? Am I getting more confident? Am I, I'd hope people worry about that more than just the title name. I know money's important, but I think those things will come if you more focus first on the skills and the development.
I agree, Karen. It's not a set it and forget it and everything is a perfect timeline. Think about, and let's compare this to the hiring process. It's not like you apply and then 3 days later you get the email and then a week later you get, it's a fluid process, like
Mhm.
we spoke about earlier in the podcast. Now, when it comes to career management, that fluidity still carries over because you're still going through, let's call it the interview process for that next role, that next level. And there's so many dynamics that play into it, like we spoke about earlier, whether it's headcount or reassignment or changing of roles and jobs. That has so many different um, facets that it's not a perfect world that you can say by this date and time I will be here. It just doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, many employees think, oh, I just hit this mile marker, therefore this then follows. It just doesn't happen that way.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, you mentioned earlier, kind of, I think you referred to it as raising the bar, which
Yes.
is a theme in your hiring. So, do you want to talk to that a little bit? I think that's a really interesting concept, and what, explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so I'll give you my opinion on Amazon, my personal opinion. We do have a process through which we do everything in the company where that we call bar raising. And what it is it allows employees to really measure themselves against others in the organization. In the hiring process, what we're really looking for is, are you better than a large set of employees already in the job doing that role? And many times you're not, right? You're coming in as an outsider. And what I'm trying to determine is Karen better than a certain number of people that are already in the role on day one? That's a really big, big ask, right?
Mhm.
But what that does is it allows us to raise that bar in terms of talent and what the expectations are, so that as we bring people into the organization, they know that that bar is constantly being moved upward. So there's this constant need to always feel, I got to perform, I got to do better, I got to improve my skills, I got to think about learn and be curious, I got to think about earning trust, I got to think about all these other things. But it really comes to that, the role is set, but like you have to evolve in your role, because as you evolve in the role, the company's evolving in their expectations.
Right, right. It's a very different process or mindset of hiring and developing versus the old school day of, if you will get a promotion after being in your job for 2 years, and you will get this raise, and this is what you'll do. And I think companies realize they need people to own it, to own what they're doing. So I think that goes to the biggest piece that I always want young people to think about when they're doing, even as an undergrad or a grad, or however, it's all about the impact mindset that you've talked about. It's how am I making an impact? And when you're doing your resume, it should be about showing how you made an impact, and not just my task was this, my responsibility was that. But if that's the same thing the person next to you can say, how are you different? How did you make a difference? You may feel like you're doing the exact same thing as that person that sits next to you, but you've got to figure out a way to stand out and to show those impact points. And in an interview, how did I make a difference, even if it's small things? So, and that's why I love the idea of doing projects or side things, to give yourself a little bit of a something unique to speak to in what you've done. So um I think it takes a lot of self-awareness. So
It does. And a lot of the times the analogy I'll use, especially to, the recent college graduates, is 4 years ago, what did you do to stand out? It was probably that essay. It was probably that community project.
mhm.
There was something unique and different that made you stand out to get to the top of the pile, right? Yes, you had your standardized test scores and you had your transcripts, but those are all quantifiable. But
Right.
what did you do to stand out? It's the same thing in business. You've already done this. You started this when you were 16 and 17 to start to think about having an impact and then branding and marketing yourself to that university. It's the same thing here. It's not a foreign concept. So what you need to do then during your collegiate years is to figure out what is the impact I had, like we discussed earlier, on the school, on the community, in the classroom. And organizationally, that's what we look for. Because as you said, there are great equalizers in academia, there's great equalizers in business. And those are the KPIs and the numbers, the metrics. But when somebody can say, I had an impact beyond my scope and role of what I do day to day, that's where you get noticed. And remember what I said earlier, managers notice those that have that impact and stand out.
Yeah, it's so true. And my message to anyone who is listening, who might be an undergrad, who hasn't felt like they've made an impact yet, well, it's never too late. Start now. And you do need things to speak to. If you haven't been involved in clubs or you haven't tried to lead the project instead of just being a team member, you're not involved in things, go sign up today because you do need things. And if you're already starting your career, maybe you're at a company where you can sign up for a philanthropy day that the company does, and maybe there's a new philanthropy partner that they might nonprofit partner they don't know about in the city or wherever city you live in. So there are ways I think to do things that are just um, day-to-day business, but also the company has a mission and a culture that there are things that are important to that company. So I think you can get involved in other ways too that people might not realize. So
Yeah, sure.
I love
It's
that.
it's interesting, Karen, because I was giving a talk recently, and one of the first questions that went up was, how important is GPA?
Hmm.
And that's pretty much been, let's call it the metric by which success is determined when you graduate, is how well did I do? It's extremely subjective, right? Did I get some great, professors that maybe had an impact? Did I get some of the easier ones? It's not universal to say that GPA is the great equalizer. Yes, it is a leading indicator of success. But to me, I don't look at that GPA. I look at what did you do while you were there? That's the story you can tell me about the 4 years you had at that college or university and the impact it had on you, on others. That's the story I want to hear, because that's the story by which I believe you're going to tell that story again in the future. And what I love about telling the story is that, you know, in my current role, we don't ask the typical questions. We ask the behavioral based questions. Behavioral based questions. Tell me about a time when. How would you respond in this? And the reason why the behavioral based questions are really critical is we're allowed to get an understanding of who that person is, how they operate, to predict their future impact and success. And the greatest predictor of future success is past behavior. And that's why going beyond the GPA is much more important in the interview process with those probing questions that are behavioral based versus just fact based. Well, what classes did you take and what did you get in this grade?
Right.
That's not a story I want to hear. I want to hear about the impact you had while there. So behavioral based is really something that I'm passionate about.
Yeah. And I love to call it impact. I use impact based blank on a lot of things. So I like to help someone write an impact based cover letter, an impact based interview prep. So it's all around your skills and the impact you made. Um, I love that. I love that. And I think, I just forgot what I was going to add in with that. Let me see if I can think of it. Oh, I also think that, believe it or not, it's everyone in investment banking, finance, whatever industry you're going into, advertising. I work with a lot of kids who also, or young people that are in the finance space. And yes, they have to do modeling and have advanced Excel skills and do that, for example. But these banks, everybody wants to know, as you say, it's also called the airport test. What is this young person going to be like to work with every day? Are they going to be collaborative, and are they going to be able to handle conflict and challenging days? And are they going to be thoughtful? Or are they going to be a team player? Or are they just super smart, never get anything below an A, but yet they're very difficult and they don't have some common sense, um, sort of aspects to who they are as a person. So I think no matter what industry you're in, everybody needs to ask these behavioral type questions. And they do ask these behavioral type questions because they want to see how you behave, as you say, in challenging situations, and not just when everything is perfect and going their way. So how you work in teams on projects, how you work in your summer job, scooping ice cream, whatever it is, you've got to be able to speak to it in a way that shows you can handle situations and you're not just on a piece of paper. You're an actual
Sure.
human being.
Sure. Well, and what I like about the behavioral based questions is it goes more that beyond the behavior, it goes into the structure and the approach as to how you would answer that question.
Yes.
Right. So I'm able to see after asking a question, tell me about a time when, and I propose whatever that question is, and then I hit them with the punchline of what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a definitive strategy for them to critically think, okay, what's the question? And then how did I get to that result? And formatically, what I'm looking for is what I would call the STAR method.
Yes.
Right? The S is the situation. And I'm going to tell them very quickly in 3 sentences, hey, Karen, here's the situation I was tasked with. Right. And I'm going to explain it very simply. Then the T in the STAR is, and here are the tasks that I was challenged to do. Right. And I lay
Yep.
that out methodically. Then I go to the A. Here are the actions I took.
Mm.
Right. So I had
Yes.
the situation, the task at hand. Here are all the actions I did. And then the last one is the R, the result. What was the result of what I did? And my behaviors that led me to this result. That's tying it all together. So you can get the best of both, which is ask those behavioral questions, which will give you indications on how they would respond. But more so than that, I want to see how did they respond and how did they approach it in a situation in something like a star format.
Yeah, it's storytelling. I use the method all the time for interview prep and actually have like a chart that I give people to make it very clear to lay out those stories. And you have to have, as I say, these mini stories. I also love to add an extra R at the end, reflection, which I think can tie up the story in a way that says, and what I learned from it, or when I reflect back on that situation, what I really, something like that kind of gives a little bit of a reflection back on what you learned.
That is a great, great point. I love the double R at the end. I will tell you one of my classic questions I'm constantly asking is, what would you have done differently?
Yes.
Which is along the lines of that reflection. And for somebody to sit there and to critically think after they just laid out their entire thing, and then they have to think, but what would I have done differently? Is that reflection? It could have been something they could have done better, something they did not foresee. But that reflection piece is important. So I love that's something you're, you know, telling the clients you work with, because that reflection piece is going to go a long way during the evaluation. Is like, and what did they learn from this? Were they willing to learn? Maybe
Right.
sometimes they're not. Maybe they're like, no, I wouldn't have done anything differently. Well, that's a pretty bold conviction, but I would say daily, I'm looking back at the end of the day and saying, what would I have done differently very often?
Yes. I would say most days everyone probably has things that maybe most things they do differently. I don't know. But yeah, no, I love the extra R, and it's something that they can end the story with, or if they have it, they have it in their back pocket if it's asked. So um I love that. I've kept you a long time, so I think we might have to wrap up, but um we could talk all day. I think you have so much to share. And what else? Anything else that we missed talking about you want to add in?
Um, let's see. Well, you mentioned the word grit earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do think that's something that I think a lot of these kids have to just get, they got to get schooled on it a lot earlier. I mean, yes, our kids are athletes, right? They got their grit from getting coming home with bruises and whacked and injuries and everything else. But I do think the grit piece is something that a lot of young talent struggles with in the workplace
Yeah.
because it is gritty. And they have to come prepared to accept feedback, whether it is in the magic loop or accept feedback that maybe they're not meeting the bar. And that's where that grit comes in, because that is to make them better. That's a developmental tool. But many times people will not accept it, and they'll not have the grit to actually, take that feedback in stride.
Yeah. And also on the other side of that, I think is there's you're coming from a whole life of a very structured life. When you're in school, you you have a class, you know the assignment, you're told the assignment, you go do the assignment, you get feedback, you get a grade. Your feedback is the grade. Or maybe there's more detail from a teacher. But when you get into the workplace, sometimes you don't have a lot of feedback on a daily basis. You're just off and doing your thing. You need to be proactive and ask for feedback, but you also need to take the time to just sometimes figure it out
Yep.
and take chances. And maybe you're going to do it wrong, but there might not be also a grade put on everything. You don't, you're going to do something. They're going to say, great, here's what's next. And there's no pat on the back even, because you're working hard. You're working towards doing things for your boss and for your team. And it's not about you. So I think there's part of that grit is being able to be independent and own what you're doing, but realize you might not be getting feedback or you know acknowledgement in a way that you're used to in that very structured academic environment that you've been living in your whole life. um, and that's fun. I think that's a good thing. You've got some freedom, but it's you got to be ready to sort of wing it a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think the thing around grit is those are the stories people remember more so than some of the epic wins. They
Mhm.
remember that tough time and that challenge. And when I'm probing on those questions, I want to know how you respond when you're really challenged, not when you're at your best, right? Because I'm expecting you to be your best, right? Those are the easy stories to tell. It's the gritty stories that can really help me understand who you are, what makes you tick. One of the authors I really like who talks about grit often is Scott Galloway, the
Mhm.
NYU professor. And he's a bit irreverent. But what I like that Galloway does is he really talks about the realities that set in when doing your job and working for companies. He talks about people that have this utopian view of, oh, I have an interest in this and a passion for that. That's where I'm going to go chase my dream. Well, good luck, because you're probably not going to make any money and be able to live in New York City and survive. So you have to marry these, the ideologies you have, but you also have to have some grittiness. So I have always appreciated Galloway, who really tells some great stories around career management and how to excel in the workplace in a realistic world, not a utopian world.
Right. I think there's some real uh, good advice there, and that you don't have to follow your passion. I used to, when I was in executive search, people would say, I love sports and I'd really like to work in sports. It's like, well, you can still follow sports or music. That would happen a lot. People say, I really love music. I want to work in music. And it's like, okay, but you don't have to work in your passion. You can still
Right.
have your passions. Um, you can, but it shouldn't be your defining criteria.
Well, Karen, the way I look at it is I'm not hiring you for your passion. I'm hiring you for your talent.
Right.
I'm hiring you for your potential. So my advice is find out what you're really talented in. What are you really good at? and take that talent and refine it and refine it and refine it so that you are so talented. You are the outlier in your industry, in your company, that you are known for that. Oh, and you can still have these passions that drive you. You can still satiate those passions, but it's about talent. What are you really good at? Get really good at it and focus on that.
Yep. Yep. And that takes time. Don't think
It
it's going to
does.
happen overnight. That will take time. And you may go down some roads and have to turn around and go in a different direction, which is fine. Um, that's awesome. I love it. So many good nuggets. I love all of this. I'm excited. This is great. Thank you so much, Brian. I
Oh,
really
good.
appreciate being on today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It was a great time and would love to come back anytime you offer, Karen.
All right. Well, maybe we'll do a part two after I read this Radical Candor and a few other things here. All right. Thank you so much.
Perfect.